Roderigo Lopez, the personal physician to Queen Elizabeth I, was gutted alive in front of a cheering mob, not because of a grand political conspiracy, but because he gossiped about a courtier's embarrassing infection. He faced this brutal execution simply because he bruised the fragile ego of the Earl of Essex by revealing the young nobleman's social disease to the Queen. It was a petty grudge that ended in a state-sanctioned murder. Essex exploited the public's hatred of Jews to ensure the court would turn against the doctor. While Lopez screamed his innocence from the scaffold, Essex secured his victory. He framed a loyal spy as a traitor just to settle a personal score. Roderigo Lopez was born around 1517 in Crato, a small sun-baked town in central Portugal. To understand Roderigo, one must understand the terrifying world into which he was born. He entered the world during a time of spiritual tectonic shifts. Portugal, in the early 16th century, was a wealthy superpower, bloated with gold from the New World and spices from the East. But internally, it was a society at war with itself. Roderigo was born into a family of new Christians, or conversos. 20 years before his birth, in 1497, King Manuel I of Portugal had issued a decree. He ordered the expulsion of all Jews from the kingdom. However, he realized he could not afford to lose the Jewish population. They were the merchants, the bankers, the cartographers, and the physicians. They were the intellectual and economic engine of the state. So, the king changed the rules. He closed the ports. He forbade the Jews from leaving. Then dragged to fonts in town squares and churches, thousands of people were forcibly baptized en masse. Holy water was sprinkled over the crowds. In an instant, there were no more Jews in Portugal. Legally, they were all Catholics. This was the lie Roderigo Lopez was born into. His family attended Mass. They ate pork in public view. They baptized their children. They adopted Christian names. But the old Christians, those with pure bloodlines, never let them forget their origins. They were marked. The Portuguese Inquisition was established in 1536 when Roderigo was a young man. Its purpose was not to hunt non-Christians, but to hunt bad Christians. They were looking for Judaizers. If you put on a clean shirt on a Friday evening, the Inquisition might suspect you were preparing for the Jewish Sabbath. If you swept your floor from the door inward rather than outward, you were suspect. If you did not light a fire on Saturday, you were suspect. Living in Crato, the Lopez family existed in a state of high-functioning paranoia. This environment shaped Roderigo's psychology. He learned early that survival depended on two things: excellence and silence. You had to be so useful that the state needed you, and so quiet that the inquisitors ignored you. Despite the shadow of the stake, Roderigo was brilliant. His intellect was his escape route. His family, likely wealthy merchants, had the means to send him to the University of Coimbra. This was his first step out of the shadows. In the 16th century, medicine was not a science in the modern sense. It was a philosophy. To study medicine at a great university like Coimbra was to study the architecture of the universe. Roderigo Lopez did not spend his days dissecting cadavers. That was considered manual labor, fit only for barbers and butchers. Instead, he studied the texts of the ancients, Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna. He learned Greek and fluent Latin. The medical worldview of the time relied on the theory of the four humors. The body was a container of four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a state of balance between them. Illness was an imbalance. If a patient was feverish, they had too much blood, hot and moist, so they must be bled. If they were melancholic, they had too much black bile. The physician's job was to act as a regulator. He would examine the patient's urine. Uroscopy was the primary diagnostic tool, check their pulse, and prescribe a regimen of diet, purging, and bleeding. While this sounds primitive to modern ears, it required immense learning. A physician had to understand astrology, as the position of the moon determined the best time to bleed a patient. He had to know botany to mix complex herbal remedies. Lopez graduated with his medical degree in the 1540s. He was now a man of status. In a world of illiteracy, a doctor of physic was a rare creature. He began his practice in Portugal, but the walls were closing in. The Inquisition was becoming more aggressive. They were burning people in the public squares of Lisbon, the auto de fe, act of faith. These were grand spectacles where heretics were strangled or burned alive while kings and bishops watched. For a new Christian, no amount of success could buy safety. In fact, success was dangerous. It bred jealousy. A rival doctor or a disgruntled servant only had to whisper to a priest that Dr. Lopez had mumbled a Hebrew prayer, and it would all be over. By 1559, Lopez made the decision that defined his life. He would not wait for the knock on the door. He joined the great exodus of the Sephardic diaspora. He boarded a ship leaving the sun of Lisbon for a cold, wet island in the north. Roderigo Lopez arrived in London in 1559, the year after Elizabeth I took the throne. He stepped off the boat into a city that was exploding. London was a chaotic wooden labyrinth of 200,000 people. It was noisy, dirty, and fiercely Protestant. For an immigrant, London was a paradox. On one hand, England was a sanctuary. Elizabeth was a Protestant queen, an enemy of Catholic Spain and Portugal. Therefore, the refugees fleeing the Inquisition were technically welcome. On the other hand, the English were notoriously xenophobic. They called immigrants strangers. There were riots against foreign artisans, who were seen as stealing English jobs. Furthermore, Jews were legally banned from England. They had been expelled by King Edward I in 1290 and never formally readmitted. So Lopez had to continue his performance. He could not be a Jew in London. He had to be a Protestant Portuguese refugee. He joined the Church of England immediately. He attended services at his local parish. He became a model subject. But London offered something Portugal did not: opportunity based on merit. The state of English medicine in 1559 was dismal. There were very few university-trained physicians in London. The medical field was dominated by quacks, unlicensed healers, astrologers, and wise women. When Lopez arrived, he brought with him the rigorous academic training of the continent. He knew the latest treatments from Paris and Salamanca. He understood the use of chemicals and minerals that English doctors were afraid of. He settled in the parish of St. Peter le Poet. He began to treat fellow expatriates, but word quickly spread to the English. Patients discovered that Dr. Lopez was different. He didn't just bleed them dry, he listened. He had a bedside manner that was calm, authoritative, and reassuring. In a time when falling ill often meant a death sentence, Lopez offered confidence. His breakthrough came when he was appointed as a physician at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. St. Bart's was one of the few hospitals that had survived the dissolution of the monasteries. It was the front line of London's health. Here, Lopez treated the poor, the sailors, the merchants. He dealt with the plague outbreaks that swept the city every summer. He set bones, treated syphilis, the great pox, and managed fevers. His success at St. Bartholomew's gave him legitimacy. He was no longer just a refugee. He was a pillar of the community. He married Sarah Anise, the daughter of a wealthy merchant who was also a new Christian. This marriage cemented his status within the Marano community, the secret network of Jews living in London. They lived a double life perhaps, but a comfortable one. They were wealthy, respected, and safe, or so they thought. Talent in London acted like gravity. It pulled you toward the center, and the center of the English universe was the royal court. The aristocracy of the Elizabethan era were obsessed with their health. They suffered from the diseases of the rich, gout from too much meat and wine, digestive issues from a lack of vegetables, and venereal diseases from their promiscuous lifestyles. They were also hypochondriacs. They lived in terror of being poisoned by their rivals. They needed doctors they could trust with their lives and their secrets. Dr. Lopez's reputation for discretion made him a hot commodity. He began treating the elite. Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's spymaster, became a patient. So did Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Leicester was the Queen's favorite, the love of her life. He was the most powerful man in England. When Leicester fell ill, he didn't call an Englishman. He called the Portuguese doctor. Lopez cured him. In gratitude, Leicester championed Lopez at court. This was the golden ticket. In the 1570s, Lopez began to move in circles that a boy from Crado could scarcely have imagined. He walked the long galleries of the royal palaces. He saw the Queen from afar. He smelled the perfumes of the courtiers, which failed to mask the scent of fear and ambition that permeated the court. But his rise was not without friction. The College of Physicians, the governing body of English medicine, was deeply suspicious of foreigners. They tried to restrict his practice. They called him an alien. Leicester and Walsingham intervened. They protected him. They saw his value. Lopez was not just a doctor to them. He was becoming an asset. Because of his background, Lopez had contacts in Lisbon, Madrid, and Antwerp. He received letters from merchants and family members abroad. In the eyes of Walsingham, every letter was intelligence. Lopez began to feed scraps of information to the English government. He was proving his loyalty. He was making himself indispensable. In 1581, the unthinkable happened. The position of physician-in-chief to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth I became vacant. There were dozens of English doctors vying for the role. It was the most prestigious job in the realm. It carried a life pension, immense social power, and direct access to the monarch. Elizabeth chose Roderigo Lopez. This decision is staggering in retrospect. Elizabeth, the Protestant queen, chose a foreigner, a known former Catholic, and a suspected secret Jew to be the guardian of her physical existence. It speaks volumes about Lopez's skill. Elizabeth was not a fool. She was paranoid and sharp. She would not have let a man near her unless she believed he was the best. Lopez's life changed overnight. He was granted a monopoly on the importation of aniseed and sumac, a royal gift that made him a very wealthy man. He moved his family to a large house in Holborn. His daily routine now revolved around the Queen. He saw her in her most vulnerable moments. The relationship between the Queen and her physician was uniquely intimate. In a court governed by rigid protocol, the doctor was one of the few allowed to touch the monarch. Lopez would take her pulse each morning. He would inspect the royal urine flask, holding it up to the light to check for cloudiness or blood, discussing the Queen's digestion and humors. He became a confidant. Elizabeth, often lonely at the top of the pyramid, enjoyed his company. He was well-traveled, educated, and possessed a dry, sharp wit that matched her own. They spoke in Latin and likely in Italian. For over a decade, Lopez was safe. He was the Queen's man. He wore a jewel at his collar. His children were well married. He had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of the Inquisition and the xenophobia of London to reach the pinnacle of success. He had become an Englishman in all but blood. Roderigo Lopez had spent a lifetime climbing a mountain of glass. By 1581, standing at the Queen's side, He seemed to have defied the odds. He was wealthy, protected, and essential to the crown. But in the Tudor court, stability is an illusion. While Lopez attended to the Queen's health, the political world around him was beginning to rot. The old protectors who understood his value were aging, and a new generation, hungry for war and glory, was sharpening its knives. The ascent was over. The long, terrifying fall was about to begin. By the late 1580s, London was no longer just a city. It was the nerve center of a war for survival. In 1588, the Spanish Armada had sailed up the English Channel, a floating city of wood and cannon intent on invasion. Though the Protestant wind and the English navy had scattered them, the threat remained. King Philip II of Spain, sitting in his granite monastery of El Escorial, was still plotting. He wanted Elizabeth dead. He wanted England Catholic. In this atmosphere, information was more valuable than gold, and Dr. Roderigo Lopez, the Queen's physician, sat on a gold mine. Lopez was not merely a doctor, he was a conduit. Because of his Jewish heritage and his Portuguese roots, he was part of a transnational network that the English Protestants could never access. He had cousins in Antwerp trading cloth. He had former classmates in Lisbon treating bishops. He had contacts in the Spanish court. For years, Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's master spy, a man who saw treason in every shadow, had managed Lopez. Walsingham understood the great game. He knew that to catch a wolf you had to don a wolf's skin. Walsingham encouraged Lopez to maintain correspondence with Spanish agents. The goal was twofold: gather intelligence on when the next armada was sailing, and feed the Spanish king lies to confuse him. Lopez played this role with skill. He received letters from Spanish officials offering him bribes to turn to their side. Under Walsingham's supervision, Lopez would reply, hinting that he might be interested just to keep the channel open. It was a classic double-agent operation, dangerous certainly, but as long as Walsingham held the leash, Lopez was safe. The Queen knew of it, the Council knew of it, it was statecraft. But in April 1590, the safety net vanished. Sir Francis Walsingham died. His death left a vacuum in the heart of the English government. Who would control the spy network? Who would vouch for the agents? Lopez, perhaps arrogantly, believed he could manage the game alone. He continued his secret correspondence with Spain. He accepted gifts like the famous jeweled ring from King Philip, believing he was still serving the Queen by tricking her enemies. He thought he was untouchable. He did not realize that without Walsingham, he was no longer a state asset. He was just a foreigner exchanging letters with the enemy. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does power. Into the space left by Walsingham stepped a figure who would define the final decade of the Elizabethan age, Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. It is hard to overstate the impact Essex had on his contemporaries. He was barely into his 20s. He was tall, athletic, and possessed a brooding charisma that captivated both men and women. He was the Queen's stepson by her favorite, Leicester's marriage, but he was also her flirtatious obsession. Elizabeth was nearly 60. Essex was 24. Their relationship was a bizarre mix of mother-son and courtly lovers. She indulged him. She forgave his tantrums. She showered him with monopolies and titles. But Essex was not content to be a male favorite. He was desperate to be taken seriously. He wanted to be a warrior hero like Drake. He wanted to be a statesman like Walsingham. He wanted to control the government. He decided that the best way to prove his worth was to become the new spy master. He wanted to uncover a great plot that would save the Queen's life and prove that he, Robert Devereux, was the savior of England. He began to build his own private intelligence network. He hired code breakers and agents. He was a hammer looking for a nail, and Dr. Roderigo Lopez was about to become that nail. History often turns not on great battles, but on small human frailties. The war between Essex and Lopez did not begin with politics. It began with embarrassment. Dr. Lopez was the physician to the entire royal circle, including the Earl of Essex. The Earl lived a life of excess. He was a soldier and a courtier, and he indulged in the sexual licentiousness common to his station. Sometime around 1592 or 1593, the Earl fell ill. He summoned Lopez. The diagnosis was clear, though never explicitly written in the court records for sake of decency. It was a venereal disease, likely syphilis or gonorrhea. It was painful, it was messy, and it was humiliating. Lopez treated him. The treatment would have involved injections of metallic salts, dietary restrictions, and likely periods of confinement. It required the doctor to see the great Earl in a state of pathetic weakness. Lopez did his job. The Earl recovered. But Lopez, usually the soul of discretion, made a mistake. He was dining with Don Antonio, the exiled claimant to the Portuguese throne, and Antonio Perez, a Spanish defector. These were men of the world, fellow chatterers. The wine flowed. Lopez, perhaps trying to impress them with his intimate knowledge of the English elite, let slip a comment. He joked about the Earl of Essex. He quipped that for all his martial bluster and chivalric posing, the Earl had required Dr. Lopez's services to cure a rather filthy ailment. He laughed, they laughed, but walls have ears. The story traveled. It whispered through the corridors of Whitehall until it reached the ears of Robert Devereux. The Earl was apoplectic. To be mocked was bad enough. To be mocked for a sexual disease was worse. But to be mocked by a foreigner, by a Jew? It was an intolerable injury to his honor. Essex's vanity was his Achilles' heel. He could not challenge Lopez to a duel. Lopez was a commoner and an old man. He could not sue him for libel without confirming the truth of the disease. So Essex decided on a different course. He would not destroy Lopez for gossip. He would destroy him for treason. Essex went to work. He knew Lopez had a history of contact with Spain. He knew about the double agent game, but Essex decided to rewrite the narrative. He would argue that Lopez wasn't a double agent working for England. He was a double agent working against England. Essex needed witnesses. He needed proof. He turned his sights on the Portuguese community in London. He targeted two men who acted as intermediaries for Lopez's correspondence, Esteban Ferreira da Gama and Manuel Luis Tinoco. These were men on the fringes. They were not wealthy doctors with royal protection. They were low-hanging fruit. Essex's private agents arrested Ferreira first. They dragged him to Essex's own house, not a legal prison, but a private holding cell. This was illegal, but Essex was the law unto himself. They demanded to know about Lopez's dealings with Spain. Ferreira, confused and terrified, initially said nothing of substance. He confirmed they exchanged letters, but insisted it was for peace negotiations. This wasn't enough for Essex. He needed a murder plot. He had Tinoco arrested next. Now he had two men in custody. He could play them against each other. When private intimidation failed to yield the correct story, Essex used his influence to have the men transferred to the Tower of London. The Tower was not just a prison, it was an interrogation center. The lieutenant of the Tower had a specific mandate to extract the truth by any means necessary. We must pause to consider what interrogation meant in 1593. It was a bureaucratic, mechanical process of inflicting pain. Ferreira and Tinoco were likely shown the instruments first, the psychological terror. The rack, which stretched the body until ligaments popped and joints dislocated, the manacles, from which a man could be hung by his wrists for hours. Under this shadow, the men broke. Tinoco, desperate to stop the pain, began to tell Essex what he wanted to hear. He spun a tale of a conspiracy. He claimed that the Spanish ministers had not just offered money for information, they had offered money for action. He claimed that Dr. Lopez had agreed to poison Queen Elizabeth. The specific details were chillingly precise, fabricated to sound authentic. They said the King of Spain had offered 50,000 crowns. They said Lopez was to use a poisoned syrup disguised as medicine. Essex had his smoking gun. Armed with these confessions, Essex marched to the Queen. He burst into her chambers, breathless with feigned terror. He fell to his knees. "Madam," he cried, "I have discovered a most villainous treason. Your life is in danger." He laid out the plot. He named Dr. Lopez as the assassin. The Queen's reaction was not what Essex expected. She did not faint. She did not panic. She looked at the young Earl with cold, hooded eyes. She knew Lopez. She had trusted him with her body for years. If he wanted to kill her, he could have done it 1,000 times already with a simple overdose of laudanum. Why would he wait for a bribe? Why would he involve these clumsy intermediaries? Elizabeth was a brilliant analyst of human nature. She saw right through Essex. She saw a bruised ego trying to inflate itself. She stood up, her red wig trembling with rage. She pointed a long white finger at Essex. "You are a rash and temerarious youth," she shouted. She accused him of fabricating the evidence to ruin an innocent man. She dismissed him from her presence. Essex fled the room, humiliated once again. He went to his chambers and sulked for 2 days, refusing to eat. But Essex was dangerous when cornered. He knew that if he didn't prove Lopez guilty, he would look like a fool and a liar. He had to make the charges stick. He doubled down. He went back to the prisoners in the tower. He ordered more questioning. The torture intensified. He needed more details. He needed Lopez implicated directly. And he began a whispering campaign in London. His agents spread rumors in the taverns and the marketplaces. The Queen is in danger. The Jew is a poisoner. The Spanish are coming. Public opinion began to turn. The fear of a Spanish plot was a potent trigger for the London mob. Finally, the pressure became too great for the Queen to ignore. She could not be seen to be negligent about her own safety. Reluctantly, heavily, she signed the warrant for Lopez's arrest. They came for him at his home in Holborn. It must have been a surreal moment for Roderigo Lopez. One moment he was the wealthy, respected physician, surrounded by his family, his books, his servants. The next, armed guards were seizing his papers, tearing through his belongings, and dragging him out into the cold winter air. He was taken to the tower. He was not put in a dungeon immediately. He was kept in the lieutenant's lodgings. At first he was defiant. He was the Queen's doctor. This was a misunderstanding. But then the interrogations began. They did not torture Lopez physically. He was an old man and the Queen's personal servant. Racking him would have been a step too far, even for Essex. Instead, they used psychological siege. They confronted him with the confessions of Ferreira and Tinoco. "Your friends have betrayed you," they said. "They have told us everything. Confess, and you might receive mercy." Lopez was confused, exhausted, and terrified. He admitted that, yes, the Spanish had mentioned poisoning in their letters. He admitted he had discussed it. But, he cried, "I only did it to cozen trick the King of Spain. I never intended to do it. I was playing the game." To Essex, this was enough. An admission of discussion was an admission of guilt. In the eyes of the law, imagining the death of the Queen was the same as doing it. Lopez realized too late that his clever double game had become his death sentence. He had walked a tightrope for years, but Essex had just cut the line. As he sat in his cell listening to the bells of London tolling, Dr. Lopez must have realized the terrible truth. The truth didn't matter anymore. He was no longer a man, he was a political symbol. He was the villain Essex needed to become a hero. The trap had snapped shut. Dr. Lopez, the man who once held the secrets of the state, was now a prisoner in its darkest dungeon. But for the Earl of Essex, an arrest was not enough. He needed a spectacle. He needed to prove to the world that his great plot was real. And so, the drama moved from the cold, private silence of the interrogation room to the heat and noise of the public court. The script was written, the stage was set at the Guildhall, and the verdict had been decided long before the first witness was called. The trial of Dr. Roderigo Lopez was not a legal proceeding in the modern sense. It was a political necessity. The venue was the Guildhall, the grand civic heart of London, chosen to maximize the public spectacle. The atmosphere was toxic. For weeks, the Earl of Essex's agents had been priming the London populace. Rumors of a great poisoning plot had whipped the city into a frenzy of xenophobia. By the time Lopez entered the hall, he was not facing a jury of his peers. He was facing a wall of hatred. The judges sat on a raised dais. Among them were the Lord Mayor of London, and crucially the Earl of Essex himself. In Elizabethan treason trials, the accuser often sat in judgment of the accused. It was a closed loop of injustice. Lopez stood alone. In 1594, those accused of treason were denied defense counsel. He was an old man, physically exhausted from weeks of interrogation, facing the sharpest legal minds in England. The prosecution was led by the Solicitor General, Sir Edward Coke. Coke is a legendary figure in English law, but on this day, he was not a guardian of justice. He was an attack dog. Coke's opening statement set the tone. He did not focus on forensic evidence. He focused on identity. He described the plot as a hydra-headed monster, but at its center was Lopez. Coke thundered to the jury, pointing a shaking finger at the doctor. This vile Jew, this wretch, a Jewish doctor, is worse than Judas himself. The rhetoric was calculated. By invoking Judas, Coke wasn't just accusing Lopez of treason, he was accusing him of deicide. He was tapping into centuries of medieval antisemitism. He argued that just as Judas betrayed Christ for 30 pieces of silver, Lopez had betrayed the Queen, God's anointed on earth, for Spanish gold. Lopez tried to speak. He tried to explain the nuance of intelligence work. I did these things to serve the Queen, he pleaded. I wanted to deceive the King of Spain, to strip him of his money and his secrets. But in the Guildhall, nuance was dead. The jury saw only a foreigner admitting he had taken money from the enemy. The prosecution's case rested on 3 pillars, all of them rot. First, the confessions of Ferreira and Tinoco, extracted under torture. Crucially, these witnesses were not produced in court to be cross-examined, preventing Lopez from challenging them. Second, intercepted letters that used merchant codes like pearls and diamonds. And third, the ring. The ring was the dramatic centerpiece. Essex produced evidence that King Philip II had sent a magnificent ruby and diamond ring to Lopez. Essex claimed this was the down payment for the assassination. Lopez, his voice trembling, offered the truth. The ring had been sent years ago. He had offered it to Queen Elizabeth immediately upon receiving it. She had refused to take it, but she'd known about it. It was proof of his transparency, not his treachery. But without the Queen there to testify for him, his word was worthless against the Earl of Essex. The trial lasted mere hours. The jury did not need long to deliberate. They returned a verdict of guilty. The sentence was pronounced. Roderigo Lopez was to be returned to the Tower, from thence to be drawn to the place of execution, and there to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. As the sentence was read, the Earl of Essex smiled. He had won. He had proven his great plot. The verdict was in. The scaffold was ready. But the execution did not happen. In the English system, the machinery of death required one final key, the monarch's signature on the death warrant. Queen Elizabeth refused to sign. This delay is the most telling aspect of the entire affair. Elizabeth was not squeamish about execution. She had signed the death warrant for her own cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. She had executed traitors by the score. But she stalled on Lopez. Why? Elizabeth was a woman of immense intellect. She reviewed the transcripts of the trial. She saw the holes in the case. She saw the heavy hand of Essex. She knew Lopez. She had looked into his eyes for a decade. She simply did not believe that her little Portuguese, as she sometimes called him, was a killer. She was angry. Angry at Lopez for his foolish gossip, yes, but furious with Essex for forcing her hand. She employed a strategy of passive resistance. She moved Lopez to a safer part of the tower. She refused to speak of the matter. When Essex pressed her, she changed the subject. Weeks turned into months. March passed, April passed, May passed. Dr. Lopez sat in his cell, suspended in a cruel limbo. Every footstep outside his door might be the messenger of death or the messenger of pardon. While the Queen stalled, the Earl of Essex worked. He could not let Lopez live. If Lopez was pardoned, Essex would be exposed as a fraud who had tortured innocent men to fabricate a plot. His political career would be over. Essex mobilized the public. The pulpit was the mass media of the day. Preachers, likely encouraged by Essex's faction, gave sermons about the danger of wolves in the fold. They reminded the people of the Spanish threat. The pressure on the Queen became unbearable. Her Privy Council was united against her. They argued that by keeping Lopez alive, she was endangering the state. She was making herself look weak, sentimental, and old. The logic of the state began to outweigh the conscience of the woman. Elizabeth realized that she could not save Lopez without destroying the credibility of her entire government and her justice system. If the court said he was a traitor, and the people believed he was a traitor, then for all political purposes he was a traitor. The truth was irrelevant. Order was paramount. Sometime in early June, exhausted and cornered, Elizabeth stopped fighting. She picked up her quill. She signed the warrant. But even then, it is said she was in a foul mood, snapping at her courtiers, carrying the weight of a decision she knew was wrong. The day broke warm and bright. The Sheriff of London arrived at the tower. They brought out 3 men, Dr. Lopez, and the 2 Portuguese intermediaries, Ferreira and Tinoco. Lopez was stripped of his fine velvet doctor's robes. He was dressed in simple clothes. They tied him to the hurdle. The journey from the tower to Tyburn was 3 miles of humiliation. It went through the heart of the city, past the merchant houses, past St. Paul's Cathedral, down Fleet Street. The crowds were enormous. This was the event of the year. They lined the streets, leaning out of windows, climbing onto roofs. They didn't just watch, they participated. They threw mud, excrement, and rotten vegetables. They screamed abuse, poisoner, Jew, traitor. Lopez, lying on his back on the wooden sled, was dragged through the filth. The physical battering was severe, but the psychological assault was total. He was being rejected by the city he had served for 35 years. They arrived at the Tyburn tree, the distinctive triangular gallows. Lopez was the first to ascend the cart. He stood under the beam. The hangman placed the rope around his neck. The sheriff asked if he had any final words. This was the custom, a chance for the condemned to confess and ask for God's mercy. Lopez did not confess. He was defiant to the end. He looked out at the sea of hostile faces, the apprentices, the fishwives, the gentlemen who had once bowed to him at court. He shouted, his voice cracking with emotion and age, "I am a Christian. I love the Queen as well as I love Jesus Christ." This statement was the final bitter tragedy. He intended it as the ultimate profession of loyalty. He was saying, "I am one of you. I share your faith. I share your love for the monarch." But the crowd's laughter drowned him out. To them, it was a joke. A Jew invoking Jesus, a traitor invoking the Queen. It was the height of absurdity. The cart was drawn away. The drop did not kill him. The Elizabethan method of hanging was strangulation, not a broken neck. He swung, kicking and choking, but the horror was not over. The sentence was drawn and quartered. The law required that the traitor be cut down alive. The executioner cut the rope. Lopez fell to the ground gasping, semi-conscious. What followed is difficult to describe, but necessary to understand the brutality of the age. The executioner took a knife. He stripped the old man. He castrated him. He sliced open his abdomen. Lopez, likely still possessing a flicker of consciousness, would have seen his own entrails pulled from his body and thrown into a fire prepared nearby. Finally, the mercy of death arrived. His heart was cut out. His head was severed. His body was hacked into 4 quarters. While the narrative of Roderigo Lopez's life and death is tragic, the true horror and the true innocence of the man is found not in the broad strokes of history, but in the minute details. We must strip away the drama of the courtroom to examine the hard evidence that sent a man to his death. To understand how Lopez was framed, we must look at the letters. The prosecution's case rested heavily on intercepted correspondence between Lopez's intermediaries and the Spanish court. In the 16th century, spies used ciphers and code words. The letters seized by Essex contained references to the pearl and the diamond. The prosecution argued that the pearl was the queen and the diamond was the poison. When the letters spoke of sending the diamond, they claimed this meant sending the murder weapon. However, historians now believe these were commercial terms used as metaphors for intelligence. The pearl likely referred to a specific piece of news regarding the English Navy. The diamond was likely the bribe money itself. Lopez was a merchant of information. He was negotiating the price of his secrets. Essex deliberately mistranslated the language of the bazaar into the language of the assassin. We must also look at the toxicology. The specific accusation was that Lopez would poison the queen using a syrup or medicine. Dr. Lopez was a Galenic physician. He knew that the queen had a team of tasters. Every dish and every spoon of medicine was tasted by a servant before it touched the royal lips. If Lopez had used a fast-acting poison, the taster would have died immediately, alerting the guards. If he had used a slow-acting poison, attributing the death to the medicine would be difficult. Furthermore, Lopez was the preserver of her health. If he wanted her dead, he could have simply done nothing. The queen was old and frail. Neglect would have been the perfect, undetectable weapon. The idea that a man of his intelligence would agree to a clumsy, verifiable poisoning plot involving foreign middlemen is psychologically and professionally inconsistent. It was a movie plot invention by men who did not understand the reality of medical practice. Finally, we must scrutinize the legal framework. The trial was a farce. Under the treason statutes of the time, 2 witnesses were generally required to testify in person. Essex knew that his witnesses might recant their confessions if freed from the threat of the rack, so he kept them in the Tower. The jury only heard their written depositions. Lopez was denied the right to cross-examine his accusers. Much of the testimony was third-hand hearsay. While Roderigo died at Tyburn, his wife Sarah was left to navigate the wreckage. In the months following the execution, a strange thing happened. Elizabeth did not seize Lopez's estate. By law, the property of a traitor was forfeit to the crown. Lopez's family should have been thrown into the street, destitute. Instead, Elizabeth quietly intervened. She allowed Sarah Lopez to keep everything: the house in Holborn, the lease on the imports, the wealth. It was a silent, posthumous apology. It was the only way the Queen could say, "I know." Sarah Innes was a formidable woman. She managed to hold the family together. Her son Anthony eventually went to Winchester College, a prestigious school, suggesting that despite the traitor label, the family retained high-level connections who knew the truth of Roderigo's innocence. The Lopez descendants remained in England, eventually assimilating completely into English society. It is a final irony that the blood of the vile Jew likely runs in the veins of many aristocratic British families today. The executioner at Tyburn had done his work. The body of Roderigo Lopez was destroyed, his remains scattered and his name disgraced. By all rights, he should have vanished into the footnotes of history. But violence of this magnitude leaves a scar on the collective psyche. The mob that cheered his death did not go home and forget. They took their hatred to the theater. The Queen's physician was dead, but a new figure was about to rise from his ashes, a character of ink and paper who would haunt the English stage for centuries. Dr. Roderigo Lopez was dead, his body destroyed, his head drying on a spike above the Thames. But in Elizabethan London, death was not the end of a story. Often, it was just the beginning of a myth. The public appetite for the Jewish villain had been whetted by the trial. The mob, having cheered the butchery at Tyburn, wanted more. They wanted to see the monster again, not on a scaffold, but on a stage. The theater managers of London were ruthless capitalists. They knew exactly how to monetize the public mood. Almost immediately after the execution, the Lord Admiral's men, the rival company to Shakespeare's troupe, revived an old play by Christopher Marlowe, The Jew of Malta. It was the perfect mirror for the moment. The play's protagonist, Barabbas, is a cartoon of evil. He is a poisoner. He is wealthy. He hates Christians. He schemes to destroy the state. In the summer of 1594, the Jew of Malta played to packed houses. The actor Edward Allen, a giant of the stage, wore a grotesque false nose and a red wig, the traditional color of Judas. When he stepped onto the boards and gloated about poisoning wells and killing nuns, the audience didn't just see a character, they saw Dr. Lopez. The line between reality and fiction blurred. The Lopez plot validated the play, and the play validated the execution. It was a feedback loop of prejudice. Watching this phenomenon was a playwright in his early 30s, William Shakespeare. Shakespeare was a man of business as much as a man of art. He saw the crowds flocking to the Rose to see the Jew of Malta. He saw the financial potential of a Jewish play, but Shakespeare rarely simply copied. He transmuted. He began to work on a new script, likely around 1596, 2 years after Lopez's death. He titled it The Merchant of Venice. Scholars have debated for centuries. Is Shylock based on Roderigo Lopez? The answer lies in the text. Shakespeare took the stock character of the wicked Jew, the moneylender, the outsider, but he injected him with a complexity that Marlowe's Barabbas never had. Shylock is a villain, yes. He demands a pound of flesh, but he is also a man who has been spat upon, kicked, and insulted by the Christians of Venice. When Shylock asks, "Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions?" He is asking the question that Dr. Lopez might have asked the jury at the Guildhall. It is a haunting possibility that Shakespeare, who moved in court circles and may have known Lopez, or at least seen him, was giving voice to the man the law had silenced. There is a specific passage in The Merchant of Venice that serves as a smoking gun, linking the play directly to the execution of Roderigo Lopez. In Act 4, Scene 1, the famous trial scene, the character Gratiano unleashes a torrent of abuse at Shylock. He calls him a currish Jew and says, "Thy currish spirit governed a wolf, who, hanged for human slaughter, even from the gallows did his fell soul fleet." On the surface, it's a metaphor about reincarnation. But look closer. The word wolf in Latin is lupus, Lopez. The pun would not have been lost on an Elizabethan audience. Lopez was a common spelling of the doctor's name in court documents. When Gratiano speaks of a wolf hanged for human slaughter, the audience would have immediately pictured the Queen's physician swinging at Tyburn. Shakespeare was explicitly summoning the ghost of Roderigo Lopez into the theater. He was reminding the audience that Shylock was not just a figure of fantasy, he was a reflection of the man they had killed 2 years prior. While Lopez's ghost haunted the stage, his destroyer, the Earl of Essex, was riding high. But history has a dark sense of irony. Robert Devereux had used the body of Dr. Lopez as a stepping stone to power. He had proved his great plot. He was the hero of the hour. But hubris is a slow poison. Essex's ambition grew cancerous. He became convinced of his own indispensability. He disrespected the Queen publicly. He turned his back on her in court, an act of staggering rudeness. When she slapped him, he reached for his sword. He was sent to Ireland to crush a rebellion. He failed. He returned to England against orders, bursting into the Queen's bedroom before she was wigged and dressed, a violation of her privacy far worse than anything Lopez had ever done. Banished from court, broke and desperate, Essex did exactly what he had falsely accused Lopez of doing. He turned against the crown. In February 1601, Essex led a chaotic, foolish rebellion through the streets of London. He hoped the people would rise up and support him. They did not. They locked their doors. Essex was arrested. He was taken to the Tower of London, the same tower where he had sent Lopez. He was interrogated. He was put on trial. The charge, high treason. The verdict, guilty. On February 25th, 1601, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, was led out to a scaffold within the tower walls. He was beheaded. The man who had orchestrated the judicial murder of the Queen's physician to prove his own loyalty died a traitor's death just 7 years later. The wheel had turned full circle. Queen Elizabeth outlived them all. Her physician, her spy, her favorite. But the final years of her reign were marked by a profound melancholia. The death of Essex broke her heart, but the death of Lopez had left her vulnerable in a more practical way. She never found another doctor she trusted as completely. As her health declined in early 1603, she refused to take medicine. She refused to go to bed, standing for hours on end, afraid that if she lay down she would never rise. Perhaps she missed the calm, authoritative voice of the Portuguese doctor who used to mix her syrups and tell her she would be well. She died on March 24th, 1603. What remains of Dr. Roderigo Lopez? For centuries, history accepted the verdict of the 1594 jury. History books listed him as a traitor and a poisoner. It wasn't until modern historians began to re-examine the archives that the narrative flipped. Today the consensus is clear. Roderigo Lopez was innocent of attempted murder. He was guilty of being arrogant and guilty of gossip, but he was not an assassin. He was the victim of a perfect storm, the insecurity of a young nobleman, the institutional racism of the English state, and the bad luck of being a man without a country. His story serves as a terrifying case study of the model minority trap. Lopez did everything right. He assimilated. He excelled. He served the state. He made himself useful to the most powerful people on earth. He thought his merit would protect him. But when the political winds changed, his merit meant nothing. To the English, he was never truly Dr. Lopez, the physician. He was always the Jew. Dr. Roderigo Lopez was a man of science who was destroyed by men of rhetoric. He was a healer, killed by soldiers. In the end, we should remember him not as the Jewish traitor of Elizabethan propaganda, nor as the caricature Shylock. We should remember him as he likely was, a brilliant, weary old doctor, sitting in his garden in Holborn, reading a letter from Portugal, trying to survive in a world that wanted his skills but despised his soul. If you walk through London today past the noise of the traffic and the steel skyscrapers, you can still find St. Bartholomew's Hospital. It is still there, treating the sick, just as it was when Lopez walked its wards in the 1560s. There is no grand statue of Roderigo Lopez. There is no plaque at Tyburn to mark where he died. But his monument exists in ink and paper. Every time The Merchant of Venice is performed, every time Shylock steps onto the stage and demands his bond, the ghost of the Queen's physician stands in the wings. He is the reminder of a time when a man's life could be extinguished by a whisper, and when the laughter of a crowd could echo louder than the truth. The story of Roderigo Lopez is not just a Tudor murder mystery. It is a warning. It asks us to look at our own world and ask, if the Queen's own physician wasn't safe, who is?